December 20th, 1943, 12:07 hours. 27,000 feet above the snow-covered killing fields of northern Germany. A Luftwaffe pilot watched through his canopy as a B-17 Flying Fortress limped through the sky, with half its tail blown away, blood streaming from holes in its fuselage, engines dead, control surfaces shredded. Every law of aerodynamics said it should be falling. Every doctrine of war said he should finish it. But what happened in the next 17 minutes would haunt two men for 46 years and prove that even in humanity's darkest hour, a single choice could transcend everything. The bomber shouldn't have been flying. It shouldn't have been airborne. By every calculation of engineering, physics, and probability, it should have been a smoking crater in a German forest. But it hung there in the frozen sky, a dying metal whale trailing vapor and fuel, its crew barely conscious, its pilot flying on instinct and prayer alone. And below, rising through the clouds with his finger on the trigger, came the man who would break every rule he'd ever been taught. The morning of December 20th had begun with the usual pre-mission tension at Kimballton, the 379th Bomb Group's base in eastern England. First Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia with exactly one combat mission under his belt, sat in the briefing room watching the red yarn stretch across the map toward Bremen. His second mission, a milk run, they'd said. Hit the Focke-Wulf factory, dodge some flak, come home for Christmas. The intelligence officer's voice carried the practiced monotone of a man who'd sent too many boys to die. Expected fighter resistance, moderate. Flak over target, heavy. Survival rate, acceptable. The words hung in the cigarette smoke like lies waiting to be exposed. Brown's B-17F, tail number 4230051, bore the nose art Ye Olde Pub, a cheerful English tavern painted by his crew in a moment of optimism that felt distant now. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer Pinky Luke, sat beside him, running through checks with mechanical precision, hiding fear behind procedure. In the waist section, gunners loaded belts of .5 caliber ammunition and tried not to think about the empty bunks that waited at Kimballton for the crews that wouldn't return. At 0847 hours, the engines coughed to life. 4 Wright Cyclone radials roaring their metallic symphony. 32 B-17s lifted from the frozen runway into a sky that promised death. The formation climbed through layers of cloud over the English Channel. Brown held position in the low squadron, tucked into the combat box formation that was supposed to create overlapping fields of defensive fire. The theory was beautiful. German fighters wouldn't dare attack a tight formation bristling with 50 machine guns. The theory had been written by men who'd never faced a Focke-Wulf 190 coming out of the sun at 400 miles per hour. They crossed into German airspace at 10:15 hours. The flak started almost immediately. Black flowers bloomed in the sky around them. Each burst was a precise calculation of altitude and speed, proximity fuses turning metal into expanding clouds of shrapnel that could shred aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency. Brown felt the concussions through the control column, felt the B-17 shudder as fragments peppered the fuselage. This wasn't moderate. This was hell opening up. Then the fighters came. They materialized out of the sun at 10:47 hours. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, veterans of the Jagdgeschwader units who'd been killing American bombers for months. They'd learned that the head-on pass was most effective, diving through the formation at closing speeds of 600 miles per hour, cannon shells ripping through cockpits before defensive gunners could track them. The first attack came like a thunderbolt. Brown saw the Focke-Wulf 190 only as a shadow. Then the world exploded. 20-millimeter cannon shells walked across Ye Olde Pub's nose, shattering the bombardier's compartment, tearing through the navigator's station. The plexiglass turned red. Second Lieutenant Bob Andrews, the navigator, died before he could scream. Staff Sergeant Samuel Blackford, the bombardier, took shrapnel through his legs and kept loading the nose guns with hands that shook from shock and blood loss. But that was just the beginning. The German fighters came again and again, wave after wave, coordinated attacks that exploited every weakness in the American formation. Brown watched B-17s around him absorb punishment that should have brought them down. He watched engines trail fire. He watched wings fold. He watched men die in explosions so violent they erased bombers from existence in a single frame of horror. Ye Olde Pub absorbed hit after hit. The No. 3 engine took a cannon shell and seized, prop windmilling uselessly. The hydraulic system failed, spraying fluid that froze in the -40-degree air. The oxygen system ruptured, filling the fuselage with a pressurized gas that could ignite from a single spark. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, called over the intercom that he could see daylight through holes in the vertical stabilizer. At 11:18 hours, they reached the initial point for the bomb run, the moment when bombers had to fly straight and level for 8 minutes while bombardiers acquired their targets. 8 minutes of zero evasive action while flak batteries below calculated range and trajectory. 8 minutes of being a stationary target in a sky of predators. Brown later couldn't remember much of the bomb run. The human brain has limits to how much terror it can process before it starts editing reality. He remembered the intercom filled with screams and calm voices issuing damage reports. He remembered the control column fighting him like a living thing. He remembered watching another B-17 take a direct flak hit that turned it into a fireball. Remembered seeing 4 parachutes blossom before the explosion swallowed everything else. At 11:26 hours, the bombs dropped. 12 500-pound high-explosive bombs fell toward the Focke-Wulf factory complex below. Brown didn't wait to see the impact. He banked away, following the formation's escape route, trying to keep up with bombers that still had 4 engines and control surfaces that responded. They couldn't keep up. The formation left them behind. Standard procedure. A damaged bomber slowed the group, made everyone vulnerable. Survival of the formation mattered more than survival of one crew. Cold mathematics written in the blood of previous missions. Ye Olde Pub fell behind, losing altitude at 300 feet per minute. 3 engines couldn't maintain formation speed or altitude. Brown fought the controls, trying to keep the nose up, but the damaged tail meant every control input had unexpected consequences. The bomber wallowed through the sky like a wounded animal. That's when the fighters found them again. A damaged bomber alone was easy prey. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They came in for the kill with the confidence of wolves circling a dying elk. FW-190s made pass after pass, their cannon fire methodical and precise. They weren't shooting to wound anymore. They were shooting to execute. The No. 3 engine exploded at 11:43 hours. Fire bloomed from the cowling, and Brown hit the feathering control before the flames could spread to the fuel tanks. 3 engines became 2. The rate of descent increased. They were at 14,000 feet and falling fast.
The tail gunner stopped responding. The top turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Bertrand Tate, reported he was out of ammunition and couldn't move his legs. The radio operator transmitted their position and damage assessment, voice calm as he described their death spiral in technical terms. At 11:51 hours, a 20-millimeter shell penetrated the cockpit. It missed Brown's head by 3 inches and struck Spencer Luke in the shoulder, nearly severing his arm. The co-pilot slumped forward, unconscious from shock and blood loss. Brown was alone now, flying a dying bomber with 1 functioning arm and a crew that was more dead than alive. The tail section had been shot to ribbons. The vertical stabilizer looked like Swiss cheese. The rudder responded only intermittently. Every turn was a negotiation with physics, every attempt to change altitude a gamble. They were at 8,000 feet, then 6,000, then 4,000. Brown's vision started to narrow, blood loss from wounds he hadn't noticed, oxygen deprivation from a mask riddled with holes. The world became a tunnel of gray static with the instruments floating in the center. Airspeed, altitude, heading. Numbers that meant life or death but were becoming harder to read. At 11:57 hours, they crossed the German coast, heading west. The North Sea stretched ahead, gray and infinite and deadly. If they went down in that water, hypothermia would kill them in minutes. But behind them, Germany still bristled with flak batteries and fighter bases. They were trapped between two forms of certain death. Then, at 12:02 hours, Brown saw the German fighter rising to meet them. Oberlieutenant Franz Stigler of Jagdgeschwader 27 had been at war since 1940. He'd flown in the Battle of Britain, shot down Allied bombers over France, survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. By December 1943, he had 22 confirmed kills and wore the Iron Cross First Class. He was an ace, a professional, a man who understood that war was a machine that consumed everything and everyone. He'd been refueling at Yavor Airfield when the alert came. American bombers withdrawing from Bremen, damaged stragglers, easy targets. He'd taken off immediately in his Bf-109 G6, the latest variant with heavier guns and better performance at altitude. The hunt was instinctive now. Find the wounded, finish them, return, repeat. He spotted Ye Olde Pub at 12:02 hours, barely 500 feet above the coastal fields. His first thought was confusion. How was this thing still flying? The tail looked like it had been attacked by a giant with a can opener. The engines were smoking. The fuselage was so riddled with holes he could see through it. Stigler armed his guns and moved into firing position. Standard procedure. Come in from the rear quarter where the tail gun couldn't respond. Close to 200 meters, fire a 3-second burst into the cockpit and engines, break away. He'd done this dozens of times. He closed the distance. Through his reflector gun sight, he could see inside the American bomber, could see bodies slumped at their stations, could see blood frozen on the inside of shattered plexiglass, could see the tail gunner hanging limped in his turret, either dead or unconscious, could see the waist gunners trying to aim weapons with hands too frozen or wounded to grip them properly, could see the pilot in the cockpit, somehow still flying, holding this impossible wreck in the air through will alone. Stigler's finger tightened on the trigger. One burst. That's all it would take. His 23rd kill. Another step toward the Knight's Cross. Another statistic in the war's endless accounting. But something stopped him. Later he would struggle to explain it, would talk about his commanding officer's words years before, about how shooting men in parachutes was murder, about how even in war there were lines that couldn't be crossed, would talk about seeing his brother's face in his mind, his brother who died in combat, about wondering if some enemy pilot had shown mercy when it mattered. But in the moment, what stopped him was simpler. He looked at that dying bomber and saw something that transcended doctrine and duty and the mechanical calculus of aerial combat. He saw 10 men who'd already died a dozen times over and somehow kept refusing. Saw a pilot who should have bailed out but stayed at the controls because that's what you did. Saw courage so profound it became something else entirely. Stigler moved his Bf-109 into formation position off the B-17's wing. Brown saw the German fighter pull alongside at 12:03. His first thought was that this was it, the final attack, the killing shot. He had no ammunition left, no way to defend, no way to evade. He'd flown this bomber through every circle of hell, and now, at the edge of survival, death was here to collect. But the German didn't fire. The Bf-109 hung there off the wing, so close Brown could see the pilot's face, could see him gesture. The German was waving, not attacking, waving. Brown's oxygen-deprived brain couldn't process it.
This violated every rule of aerial combat. Enemy fighters didn't escort you, they killed you. Stigler saw the American pilot staring at him with an expression that cycled through confusion, terror, and desperate hope. He gestured again, more emphatically. "Fly straight. Don't turn toward land. Head west over the water. I'll stay with you." They flew together at 500 feet above the German coast. Any flak battery could have opened fire. Any Luftwaffe base could have scrambled fighters. Stigler was committing treason by every definition of military law, giving aid to the enemy, failing to engage, allowing a bomber to escape that could return and kill German civilians. But he stayed. They passed over Wilhelmshaven, where 88mm batteries tracked them but held fire, confused by the German fighter escorting an American bomber. Passed over coastal installations where soldiers watched with binoculars, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Stigler woggled his wings at one point, a universal signal of "don't shoot," hoping whoever was watching would understand. Brown kept flying west. The North Sea stretched ahead, and beyond it, England, home, life, a chance. He'd stopped trying to understand why the German was helping him, stopped questioning the miracle, just flew, just kept the bomber level and prayed the engines wouldn't quit. At 12:17 hours, they reached the open water, the point where German fighters typically broke off pursuit because of fuel limitations. Stigler held position for another minute, making sure Brown was clear of the coast, making sure the bomber was stable enough to continue.
Then he saluted. Brown saw the gesture through the cockpit glass, saw the German pilot raise his hand in formal military respect, the kind of salute you give to an equal, to someone who'd earned it. Brown, operating on instinct and the last fragments of consciousness, saluted back. Stigler banked away and disappeared into the gray European sky. Brown flew west for another hour and 14 minutes before he reached the English coast, flew on autopilot, his mind somewhere between consciousness and shock-induced hallucination. The crew, those who were still alive, said nothing. What words existed for what they'd just experienced? They landed at Seething, an emergency airfield, at 13:31 hours. The gear barely deployed, the brakes barely worked. The bomber rolled to a stop, and Brown shut down the engines with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The ground crew who came to inspect Ye Olde Pub stood in silence. The chief mechanic, a man who'd seen hundreds of damaged bombers, walked around the aircraft 3 times before speaking. His assessment was simple and absolute. This bomber was unflyable, had been unflyable. The fact that it had flown at all violated aeronautical engineering. The fact that it had flown for over 2 hours on 2 engines with its tail shot to pieces was impossible. But then everything about that day was impossible. If you made it this far, you're the reason channels like ours can keep the past alive. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Drop a like and subscribe so these voices from history continue to be heard. Brown filed his after-action report, but left out the German fighter, left out the escort, left out the Mercy. Military intelligence would never believe it, would accuse him of hallucination or cowardice. The crew was debriefed, treated for wounds, and quietly told never to speak of it. Charlie Brown was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and returned to combat. He flew 29 more missions before rotating home, each one haunted by the memory of that gray afternoon and the enemy pilot who'd chosen humanity over duty. Franz Stigler landed at Jever at 12:58 hours with his guns unfired. He filed a report claiming he'd encountered an enemy bomber but lost it in the clouds. His commanding officer looked at him with an expression that suggested disbelief, but asked no questions. In Nazi Germany in 1943, some lies were safer than truth. Stigler flew 487 combat missions before the war ended, never telling anyone about the American bomber he'd spared. The war consumed millions. Stigler survived, immigrated to Canada after Germany's defeat, became a businessman. Brown returned to West Virginia, became a State Department officer, carried the memory of that day like a wound that wouldn't heal. Both men tried to forget. Both men couldn't. For 46 years they existed in separate worlds, connected by a moment neither could explain to anyone who hadn't been there. The German pilot who'd committed treason, the American pilot who'd been saved by his enemy. What do you do with a memory like that? How do you reconcile mercy in the middle of humanity's worst atrocity? In 1989, Brown finally broke his silence. He was retired, living in Florida, and something about the approaching end of his life made him need to find the truth. He wrote a letter to a newsletter read by former Luftwaffe pilots, described the day, described the damage, described the escort, asked if anyone remembered. 4 months later, a letter arrived from British Columbia. It began simply, "I was that pilot." They met in 1990 in Seattle, two old men who'd been young warriors, who'd faced each other across the narrowest distance between life and death, who'd shared 17 minutes that defied everything war was supposed to be. The moment Brown saw Stigler walk through the airport terminal, he knew, would have known anywhere. The face was older, the hair gray, the body bent by 70 decades of gravity, but the eyes were the same. The eyes that had looked at him through the cockpit glass and chosen mercy. They shook hands, then, unable to maintain the formality, embraced. Two men crying in an airport terminal, mourning and celebrating and trying to process decades of silence and questions finally answered. Stigler told his story, how he'd closed to firing range and seen the carnage inside the bomber, how his commander's voice had echoed in his mind. "If I ever see you shoot at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." How he'd decided that a pilot flying a destroyed bomber was no different than a man in a parachute, helpless, defeated, out of the fight. How he'd lived with the decision every day, wondering if he was weak or strong, cowardly or brave. Brown told his story, how he was certain the German was going to kill them, how the escort had saved them not just from fighters, but from flak batteries that would have opened fire if not for the Bf-109's presence. How he'd carried guilt for surviving when so many hadn't, wondering if he'd earned it. How he needed to thank the man who'd given him 46 extra years of life. They became inseparable, brothers forged in that impossible moment, spent their remaining years together, traveling to air shows and schools, telling the story to audiences who struggled to believe it, proving through their presence that even in war's worst darkness, individual humans could choose light. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at age 92. Charlie Brown died on November 24, 2008, at age 87, 8 months apart, as if they'd been waiting to complete the journey together. There are moments in history that transcend their immediate circumstances and become something larger, parables, symbols, mirrors reflecting truths we'd rather not face about ourselves and our species. December 20th, 1943 was one of those moments. The story of Ye Olde Pub and the German fighter who spared it is not a story about World War II, not really. It's a story about the choice that exists in every human moment, the choice between the mechanical following of doctrine and the assertion of individual moral agency. Franz Stigler had every reason, every justification, every order to destroy that bomber. Military necessity, duty to country, the accumulated rage of watching his own cities burn under Allied bombing campaigns, the career advancement another kill would bring, the simple, brutal logic that war is kill or be killed, and mercy is weakness. He chose differently, and in that choice, he demonstrated something profound about human consciousness. We are not our circumstances. We are not our orders. We are not the ideologies that cage us or the doctrines that define us. In the end, we are the choices we make when everything tells us to choose wrong and only conscience whispers there's another way.
Military historians study the Battle of Bremen as a footnote in the Allied strategic bombing campaign.
They calculate loss rates and target damage and strategic impact. They miss the real story. The real story is that on one gray afternoon, two pilots found themselves at the intersection of duty and humanity and chose humanity. That bomber should have fallen. By every calculation of physics and warfare and probability, it should have augmented the statistics of loss, should have become another tail number in the casualty reports, should have been forgotten except as data in a ledger of sacrifice. But it didn't fall, because one German pilot looked at courage and saw something worth saving, saw humanity where doctrine saw only targets, saw brothers where propaganda saw only enemies. The bomber flew home because Franz Stigler understood something that most warriors learn too late or never learn at all, that honor isn't about killing, it's about knowing when not to. That courage isn't about pulling the trigger, it's about having the strength to hold fire when everything demands blood. In 1943, the world was burning. Millions were dying in industrial slaughter. Humanity had mechanized death and applied it with terrible efficiency. The Holocaust, the Eastern Front, the Pacific War, bombing campaigns that turned cities into ash, the entire architecture of civilization bent toward killing. And on December 20th, at 12:02 hours, one German pilot said no. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became famous after they reunited, documented in books and films and countless retellings. But the fame misses the point. This isn't a feel-good story about enemies becoming friends. It's a challenge to every moral calculation we make about ourselves and others. How many times do we reduce people to labels? Enemy, terrorist, criminal, other. How many times do we let doctrine override conscience? How many times do we choose the safe, approved action over the difficult, moral one because questioning orders is harder than following them? Stigler's choice wasn't safe. If he'd been caught, if someone had reported what he'd done, he could have been court-martialed and executed. Nazi Germany in 1943 didn't tolerate mercy toward enemies. Soldiers who failed to fight were shot as traitors. He did it anyway, because in that moment, doctrine mattered less than the reflection he'd have to face in the mirror. Survival mattered less than integrity. Winning the war mattered less than not becoming the monster the war wanted him to be. The bomber that should have fallen became a symbol of something war tries to destroy but can never quite eliminate: the persistent, stubborn, irrational human capacity for empathy, for seeing past uniforms and flags and propaganda to the shared humanity beneath, for choosing compassion when rage would be easier. This matters now more than ever. We live in an age of dehumanization, where algorithms reduce people to data points, where tribal identities override individual complexity, where it's easier than ever to hate categories of humans we've never met. The story of December 20th, 1943 stands as testimony against all of it. It says, look closer, see deeper, choose harder. Remember that the enemy has a face, a family, a fear of death just like yours. Remember that in the moment when you have power over another person's life, what you choose defines not them, but you. Ye Olde Pub was scrapped for parts after the war. The metal was recycled, melted down, reformed into peacetime objects. The bomber itself ceased to exist except in photographs and memory. But what happened on that December afternoon persists, lives in every telling, grows with every person who hears it and carries it forward, becomes part of the moral inheritance we pass to the next generation. The bomber that should have fallen teaches us that rules are not destiny, that doctrine is not ethics, that following orders is not the same as doing right. It teaches us that individual humans in individual moments have the power to choose mercy over murder, compassion over cruelty, humanity over hate. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown spent 46 years in silence, carrying their secret, wondering about the other man, processing a moment that defied everything they'd been taught about war. When they finally reunited, what they found wasn't closure, but continuation. The story hadn't ended in 1943, it had only begun. Because the real story wasn't about a bomber that stayed in the sky, it was about the pilot who let it fly. About the moment when one man looked at another and saw not an enemy, but a brother. About the choice we all face every day in smaller ways, to be kind when cruelty is easier, to be brave when fear is safer, to be human when ideology demands we become less. The bomber flew home on December 20th, 1943, not because of aerodynamics or luck or fate. It flew home because Franz Stigler decided that some things matter more than victory, that preserving life matters more than taking it, that courage sometimes means letting your enemy live. And in that decision, he won something far greater than any military decoration could measure. He won his humanity back from a war that tried to take it, proved that even in darkness, individual light can shine, demonstrated that we are not defined by the worst things we're ordered to do, but the best things we choose to do when no one is watching. That bomber should have fallen, but it flew, and in its flight, it carried a truth more powerful than any weapon, that mercy is not weakness, compassion is not surrender, and humanity, even in war's worst moments, endures. The gray sky over Germany on December 20th, 1943, witnessed a miracle not of metal and engines, but of moral courage, of a German pilot who looked at duty and chose conscience, of an American pilot who survived to tell the story, of two men who proved that even in humanity's darkest chapter, individuals can author different endings. The bomber that should have fallen didn't just fly to England that day. It flew forward through time, carrying a lesson every generation needs to remember, that in the end, we are defined not by the wars we fight, but by the mercy we show, not by the enemies we destroy, but by the humans we save. Even when everything, doctrine, duty, decades of hate, tells us to pull the trigger, sometimes the greatest victory is choosing not to fire at all.